Welcome into the newest episode of Side Mission. I, like always, am your host, Rusty Ellis, joined by just two of the boys this week, Kyle and Matt No Thacker. And today, we're talking about the Dead Space remake. Kyle, I know you're hyped for this episode, my man.
Oh, I definitely am.
Yeah, this is one that you talked about for so long, and there's going to be a couple different things we'll discuss this episode. Most of it will be about Dead Space. The latter part of this episode, 100%, is going to be how the fuck did Callisto Protocol go so poorly when this remake went so perfectly? But let's go ahead and jump right in. I've never played a Dead Space game. I'd always heard that they were some of the scariest games from, that generation of gaming, the 360 and PS3 days. I always heard they were terrifying. I'm ready to publicly own up that I always thought they were overrated or overhyped when it came to the horror. This remake, Kyle, possibly one of the scariest games I've ever played.
Absolutely. This game was terrifying. I mean, I would say the first 8 to 10 chapters on my first playthrough, I was still, almost to the end of the game, opening doors and aiming down the sights immediately, slowly peeking around corners, and anytime the lights went out, I was running. I was running away from enemies. I was running away from those fans that were about to jump scare me. It was
punching the shit out of fans.
Yeah, for real. Every time I saw one of those fans, I broke it because I was like, you are not jump scaring me later. They knocked it out of the park with the way that they did this horror and, still had jump scares, but that wasn't, 90% of the horror. There was so much situational stuff. The very first scene where, before you even get a gun and you're behind the glass and you see that necromorph come down from the ceiling and kill Chen, that shit was scary. And then they all just start coming out of the walls and you're having to run down that long hallway. That shit really, it sets the mood for, just how terrifying this is. And I gotta say, coming from Callisto Protocol, it's insane to see how much better a game that came out over a decade was. I really wonder where they went so wrong with Callisto.
Yeah, I just don't get it. I think we know kind of the problems that Callisto had. It was the bad dodge mechanic and the heavy emphasis on melee combat. I think that was it, yeah. Dead Space is a very methodical game. It's not very fast paced. It's not, just off the rails action the entire time. It's a very slow paced game, but Callisto Protocol was like a crawl. It was...
Yes.
They basically said, as slow as Dead Space was, cut the speed in half. But the problem is that all the enemies in that game were super fast. The enemies in Dead Space are fast, but you never feel just overwhelmed at any real point. You feel like you've always at least got a chance if you play smart. Kyle, you've got the platinum already as we're recording this. You played on Impossible. You're probably sitting there like, oh, he's full of shit. But
this was hard.
I feel like they at least give you a chance in this game, where on the harder difficulties in Callisto Protocol, dude, it feels like it's just unfair. So, Matt, you also played the original, didn't you? Or am I remembering that incorrectly?
No, I did play the original on PlayStation 3.
How big of a step up do you think this remake is from the original?
So when I first heard about Dead Space getting a remake, I was kind of skeptical about it, especially at the fact that Visceral Games was disbanded by EA several years ago. And hearing that a new studio working with EA was going to bring Dead Space to current-gen consoles was a really, really shocking announcement when I first heard about it. But I was very intrigued about it because Dead Space on the original PlayStation 3 was quite the looker. I do recall being fairly impressed with it, especially because the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 era was the first time that consoles went HD.
Yes.
And I didn't have a lot of experience with horror type games. I kind of just stayed clear of them outside of Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which were the top masters of horror in the genre at the time. But I played a lot of BioShock, which did have a bit of that horror aspect to it with the exploration. So when I first heard about Dead Space, I was, very curious about it. I downloaded the demo the day it came out, tried it out. I thought it was great, and I ended up getting it through GameFly at the time. And
Boy,
I
that's a
played through it, and
throwback
I
right
beat
there.
Yeah, for real.
A
Yeah,
Gamefly
Gamefly.
reference, man. That's one heck of a reference there.
And you only get to keep the game for about a week, so I kind of rushed myself through it. But
Yeah.
it was one of the most memorable games for me at the time. It stuck with me, like the enemy design of the Necromorphs, all the different types that the game shows, and this remake did it justice. Like Visceral Games created such an amazing concept. This, floating ship called the Ishimura. Is that correct?
Yes, the Ishimura.
Just and it just even the concept Dead Space. It's just like it goes so well with the whole theme. And playing the remake brought me back to that time, and I was like, this game really stands out from a lot of horror games, like in this genre. And it's like with like you never know what's around that corner. The moment you open a door, you get a jump scare. The lights flickering off and on. Sometimes if you're like standing really still, you'll hear whispering, and we'll get more into that as to why the main character Isaac is hearing that. It's just, especially when you have the Pulse headset on, you're playing it in the dark, and
Terrifying,
the room you're playing in is quiet. It's just, the atmosphere is perfect, and I could not have asked for a better remake.
I will say, as somebody who had not played the original, I feel like, and Kyle, you can tell me what you think here. Yeah, you both can tell me what you think here. I feel like this is similar to anyone that hadn't played Last of Us when Last of Us Part 1 launched for, as the PS5 exclusive. I feel like this is the definitive way to experience it.
I agree.
This is like, if you had the choice of, and again, you go back and look at the original looked really good for its time. It was a really, really good looking game for its time, and obviously it had the impact on the horror genre that it had. I have to ask, when you guys played it when you were younger, did either of y'all have trouble sleeping? Because I've heard horror stories from other people that played it that they had trouble sleeping after playing this game when they were younger.
I did after the second game.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh, the second game.
The second game was the scariest. Yeah, I hope they remake the second one because this one's scary, but the second game knocks it out of the park tenfold with the horror. Oh man! And then the third game was horrifyingly bad.
Yeah,
but
I have heard that.
I really think that this absolutely is the definitive way to experience Dead Space, solely because they fixed a lot of issues from the original game. Like, for example, Matt's brought up a lot that getting to go back to areas from earlier chapters is such a big plus for those of us who are going for the completion. For people who want the platinum, you don't have to follow a guide, from beginning to end. You can go back and kind of explore everything to find all of the collectibles and all the hidden stuff, on your own. Another big change was Isaac Clarke was a silent protagonist in the original game, and in this game...
Okay, that I didn't know. I was not aware of that.
Yeah. I think that having him speak, all of his dialogue, matched so much better than having him as a silent protagonist, because... And this is just my theory, but I think what they're setting up for is to kind of change the story, the way the story went for Dead Space 2, so they can completely revamp Dead Space 3, because it makes sense for them to remake 1 and 2 when they're really good, but there is obviously that elephant of the room that there's a third game. Do you remake that game if it was a commercial flop the first time? This, in my personal opinion, if they are redoing the story to change 3 entirely, that would be a great move, and that in of itself, I think, would be the best reason to get into Dead Space now versus playing the older games, because those of us who did were very disappointed by the third game, whereas with this series, they might end up fixing it, and this trilogy will end up being better than the original.
Yeah, I think there's 100%. If they do decide to go on and remake 2 and then maybe, completely redo 3 from the ground up. Obviously there's probably a chance they do that if, they do a second one and it has as much success as this one's had so far. I absolutely would be interested in that. Looking further into this game, I want to talk more about what you said, Kyle, about how this game, how it does horror. Because there are jump scares. But I think that this game versus Callisto Protocol, The biggest thing is it's not over reliant on jump scares because there's quite a few jump scares in this game, but the biggest piece of the horror genre that takes place in this game is the atmosphere, is the tension you feel walking down every corridor, opening every door. Like you said, I very much did the same thing where the entire game, even though for the most part nothing ever really jumped out at me from behind a door, I would have my gun up, aimed, ready to fire. And I think that is a very, very that's a lost art of the horror genre, is creating that feeling of dread and that feeling of being scared enough to, that nothing's really happening, that nothing's happened to this point, but what if the next one is the one that starts it? What if the next one's the one point in the game where they do this? Like,
Right.
I can't praise this game's atmosphere enough because, again, jump scares are one thing, and jump scares can be scary if they're done properly, but when you mix that with an atmosphere like this game, it's hard to not think that this is one of the greatest horror games of all time.
Yeah, I agree. This game,
full agree.
yeah, this game does horror so well. And horror games aren't really my forte. I don't play a lot of them, but when a game's story is good enough to get me to play that horror game, and I'm actually, rewarded for things like exploring and not punished for it, like in Callisto, when I'm actually able to go back to older chapters, when your impossible mode isn't really that impossible, actually. I mean,
Very
it was
doable.
hard, yes.
Yeah, it's very doable.
But yeah, it was doable. It was very balanced. I mean, all around, every bit of this game was, I think such a staple in horror. And if they are going to be remaking the second one, I highly suggest anybody listening that if you have not played this, you should pick this up, because there's just so many parts within the story that I think when you're going through and you're seeing things that aren't necessarily loud, or, they're not genuinely just scary. Like, there's one part where you're going, down this hallway and you see this guy at the end of the hall just like banging his head on the wall over and over, and then when you get to the end of the hall, he just bangs his head one last time and he dies and he just falls over. It's stuff like that that makes this game so creepy, so just it keeps you on edge, those hairs raised. And instead of relying on just loud boo, I gotcha, over and over and over, they are able to set a tone that sticks with you, I think, from beginning to end.
Matt, let's talk a little bit more about the story, too, because the story takes a lot of twists and turns, and to be quite honest, we could throw a spoiler warning up, even though, this is a game that's been out for well over a decade now, so I don't really think we need to. Everybody that's played the game knows the story. I will say, as a new player, there are certainly some hints in there that things are not quite as they seem. But
yeah,
I still think that all of the twists in this game, Matt, are really well executed.
Yeah, I think that the way that the story is set up is that you are on this this mission to go to Ishimura with your crew. Isaac, he's with Kendra, Chen, and then Zach, and they're going up there, and they just they notice that something just isn't right. So it's like once they land and things really get started, and you get your first appearance of the necromorph, and that like this story, like this game is going to, it's not as it seems. Like there's something more going on here, especially because Isaac is there to see Nicole, his girlfriend, and as you progress further through the game, you get like all of these story beats when you pick up these recordings that are all over in the game, and you find out just exactly what happened here on the Ishimura, and you find out these doctors are running these tests, and there's this cult that basically worship this marker that is, causing people to become necromorphs that are just, basically the whole premise of the game revolves around this marker. And as Isaac is progressing throughout the game, he starts to get affected by this marker. Like that's where you start hearing whispers and stuff like that. When you're a little bit further into the game, the vision, like the screen will start kind of blurring, and those whispers will get louder. Because it's like, as you're progressing through the game, the marker is just affecting Isaac more and more. and it all leads up to like the big final twist at the end of the game. Which I guess is it okay to go ahead and talk about that?
Yeah, let's. Again, this game's been out for over a decade. If you're worried about
Right.
spoilers, like you're kind of dumb.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like the big twist is you run into this NPC called Elizabeth Cross. You run into her, I believe, in food storage. Correct.
I believe
Yeah,
so.
about halfway
Yeah.
through the game.
She's basically trying to. She has her love interest. I think Jacob Temple.
Yes.
And as you're progressing through the game, there's betrayal everywhere. This character named Mercer. He's like the really big bad guy. Like
Dr.
he
Mercer,
created
yeah.
this. He created this unkillable necromorph. Who, let me just say, if for anyone who played Resident Evil remake and Resident Evil, two remake and three remake,
was it
Mr. X,
2 remake or which remake are you?
it was
talking
2
about?
remake. It was
Yeah.
2 remake and 3 remake where there's this enemy you cannot kill and you have to wait for a cutscene to happen or dialogue to happen to keep progressing, and all you can do is you can shoot his limbs and knock him down, but he just reforms himself, and that builds up so much tension. And like when you get to the final end of the game and you find out that one of the people that you came to the Ishimura with, Kendra Daniels, is actually not who she says she is. She's basically there to put an end to everything, but she ends up revealing to you the truth that the whole entire time that the Nicole that you're seeing is an illusion created from the marker was actually Elizabeth Cross that you're seeing.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
the story beats just get more and more like twisted, especially if we're going to talk about the ending when Isaac is finally leaving the Ishimura after beating the giant, like I don't even know what that thing is called.
The hive mind,
Leviathan?
yeah. The
hive mind?
The hive mind, that's what it's
Yes,
called. The
the hive
Leviathan.
mind.
The Leviathan is that thing you fight in food storage and then you fight again on the outside of the ship. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it all leads up to that, and then you see Nicole, and she turns her head, and it's a bit of a jump scare because I definitely remember being affected by it when I was younger when I played the first game. So I was glad that they kind of kept that ending there. And they did add an alternate ending, which I thought it was really cool that in New Game Plus they added something that was not in the original, and it led to a secret ending that you found these marker pieces strewn throughout the levels. And I personally did not do that part, Kyle. I know you did, so you did get to see the secret ending, and you told us about it. But it didn't really seem to change that much, which is why if they do a sequel, that I think that it'll stick to
the canonical
how Dead
ending.
Space 2 was. Yeah, I think that it's going to be a remake of 2. I don't think they're going to change that much.
Yeah, Kyle, let's talk about the platinum here because I think that we don't really talk about our platinums very much on this show. First of all, a very, very low platinum percentage. The last we looked, it was like 0.2%.
Yeah.
Like it's still, and it's even if it's gone up a little bit, I still think it's less than 1% at this point in time. At least at the date of recording, like it's a low percentage. Talk about this platinum and just how much work you had to put in to get it.
Yeah, so this game, first of all, I had to go through and had to beat the game so I could unlock New Game Plus. And my thought process was, when I beat this game, I'm just going to go back through on New Game Plus doing impossible difficulty. And it turns out you couldn't do that because you have to start a brand new game and you have to make it through the entire game without dying. That was the hardest part because there were quite a few sections where you can actually get soft locked, where this tentacle comes out and grabs you, and you have to shoot its weak point to get it to release you. However, if your guns are not strong enough or you don't have enough ammo because you're on the hardest difficulty, the enemies have a lot more health, you can get soft locked to where you can't progress and have to restart again. And I was very lucky to have gotten out of those. But other than that, I would say that the impossible difficulty wasn't really extremely challenging. It was very balanced. But to me, the reason why I think this platinum percentage is so low is because the idea of impossible difficulty is definitely a lot more intimidating
Yes.
than it actually is. It sounds worse, but once I got into it and I was a couple of chapters in, it actually wasn't terrible. I think I beat impossible difficulty in like 2 days.
Yeah.
Um,
Unemployment life's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it really is. Yeah, if you are looking at going for the platinum, definitely try out that impossible difficulty because it sounds hard, but if you just are persistent with it, you could definitely get it done. I would say this is probably one of my hardest platinums to date, just because of how much work went into it. Um, but I'm definitely very proud of it, especially because this was a horror game, and I am not the biggest horror game fan.
I think the biggest criticism I have with this game is unfortunately the voice acting. The voice acting
Oh yes,
is very rough. Sound design, I think 90% of the sound design in this game is really good. I think that the voice acting is really bad. It sounds pretty much like outside of Isaac, they pretty much took the original audio, didn't really remaster it or kind of clean it up at all and give it that new fresh sound. It's not like they just kind of took it straight from the original game and plugged it straight into this, and it kind of shows because it sounds a little tinny. It's just not great. And I think that if you were going to go all out on this remake, why would you stop there? Why is that like the one thing you didn't make any update to? But listen, if you're listening to this and this is the only thing we can really critique about this game, that means the game's pretty fucking good. Like,
Yeah,
that
very
means
true.
that means that this remake was pretty damn good. I'd give it an easy 9. Easy
Yeah.
9. Like, with an argument for a 10. With an argument for a 10. This game 100%.
Yeah.
If you gave it a 10, I couldn't really argue against it. I mean,
I was really close to giving it a 10. The voice acting was my only criticism that kept it from a 10. Because the other ones, I think I could look past for a 10.
I don't know
But
what other
the voice
criticisms I would
acting-
have. That's my thing.
For me,
So-
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one other thing that you could probably critique it on, and this is just solely maybe from person to person, is some of the zero G sections were a little.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
frustrating. But I mean, at the same time, I think it's a cool thing they tried to do. Did it work
Yeah.
100%?
It
No, but
definitely is.
I see what you mean, though, Matt.
Like, I like those sections because when you are out in space, it's so quiet. And that's just how it would be in real life, like when you're
Yes.
up there.
Yes.
Like, I thought that then that's where the sound design really came in really well, especially when the enemies are attacking you and you can hear Isaac's heartbeat in space. Like, it is so ambient.
Yeah, the movement controls in space were definitely a little bit wonky, but I mean it wasn't really terrible, honestly.
Yeah.
I think that, for what you had to do, and there really weren't that many sections with it in there as well. Like, it was, I would say, 3 big sections where you were actually out in space having to, like, do stuff. But
I
yeah,
think the second
voice
Leviathan
acting-
the second Leviathan fight is the peak of
Yeah.
the game.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the peak of the
Yeah.
game, in my opinion.
That shit was awesome.
I'd say. Go ahead, go.
Yeah, I was so excited to fight some giant ass monster outside the fucking spaceship because that was real dead space. Like, I mean, we were just out floating in the middle of the. I mean, that shit was so terrifying, but yet at the same time, it was so much fun. And then when the fucking Valor just crashed right into the Ishimura, that was
Yeah.
such an intense scene.
Yeah, that was great. That was awesome. There's one part in Zero G that I think that would probably be my only nitpick as far as the levels go, and that's where you are in this giant room and you have to rip off these panels.
Yep, I know exactly what you're talking
line them up
about.
to get them to line up to the very top to get the satellite running. I kept losing the panels. Like, I was like, where are they? What? There's just so much stuff floating in that
Yeah.
room. I'm just trying to find the right ones to match.
I ain't even going to cap. Kyle helped me through that section. I'm
That
not.
section
I'm not
was
even
so
going to cap.
frustrating.
That section sucked. I was not a fan of that. But again, like, these are nitpicks. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
if you love puzzles in these kind of games, then maybe the zero gravity doesn't bother you as much. So it's one of those things where, like, it's what we're saying is very, very subjective. Like, you could very easily make the case that the zero gravity parts are a vital part of the game, and maybe the voice acting isn't a big problem for you. It might not be a problem. It was for us, but I mean, we're really nitpicking if that's what we're saying our big criticisms of this game are. So that kind of gets to what we've hinted at this whole time. How the fuck did they get Callisto Protocol so wrong? I can't figure
Yeah,
that
for real.
out. Like, Kyle, I'll start with you, and then Matt, you can give your thoughts on that. I can't make sense of how Callisto Protocol was as disappointing as it was, but yet the remake of Dead Space and even the original Dead Space are as great as they are.
Yes, I honestly To see the same studio who made Dead Space make a new, very similar horror
Yeah.
game, I was excited, and I was so ready for that game to come out because I knew I was like, Dead Space is it's a horrifying game, but the gameplay is so much fun. I was like, I know these guys can make a good game. I saw them do it before. I don't know why they couldn't do it again. I really feel like they overcomplicated it and should have just, taken a more basic approach. In this game, in reality, the combat is not that complicated. There are a ton of different weapons to choose from in Dead Space, but the premise is still the same. Cut off their limbs. That's how you kill them. And in Callisto Protocol, I mean, you didn't have to necessarily do that exact same thing, but you could have, still focused a little bit more on the, gun combat rather than the melee combat, not had a dodge system because Dead Space didn't need a dodge system. There was
Agreed.
no dodge, and I mean, even on impossible difficulty in the final boss fight, I was completely fine just moving around because I was capable of dodging attacks. And I think if your combat is balanced enough, you don't really need a dodge system that much. And that is where I think Callisto Protocol really went wrong because they focused so much on their melee combat and that stupid left to right dodge system that it just made it so slow and clunky and unappealing.
Yeah, for me, I personally say where Callisto Protocol went wrong is the fact that I had a kind of a hard time caring about the main character. I just thought he was this like average, like bald-headed Marine type. And I
get
know
that.
I know that Isaac is pretty much the same way without the helmet, but the character design of Isaac and the suit itself is something that
Iconic.
is iconic. Exactly, like the health bar being that long blue line. I've seen that stuff plastered on T-shirts. And I just think that the story beats as well. I didn't really care about, wanting to know what happens next in Callisto Protocol. It wasn't catching me. And as Kyle said, the combat system was very clunky. And I didn't really care much for the enemy types. And I was getting so sick and tired of the two-headed freaking
The two-head, again, like
zombie thing. It was
horrific
it was
enemy
frustrating.
names as well. They literally just called that a two-head.
They created this enemy that's basically a sponge, but with the necromorphs, there's a concept there, which is to use your weapons and cut off their limbs, and then using, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, stasis?
Stasis, yes.
Using the stasis to pick up the limbs of the necromorphs when you shoot off their limbs, and to, like, use those as weapons was, like, added so much to the combat, and
It's
just
creative.
Like, trying.
That's the
it's
big
creative.
thing.
And trying to survive and being able to pick up objects using stasis and thrust them at the enemies. It was so disappointing going back on Callisto Protocol, knowing that this was a lot of developers from Visceral Games. Like, this is what they made. These were the godfathers of Dead Space, but they just couldn't quite get it right this time around.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think y'all are spot on. I think that a lot of it is the story for Callisto just doesn't. There's not enough movement in the story for you to really care. Whereas in this one, it feels like every chapter you're learning more and more. There's a little bit of a twist. You're kind of figuring out more about characters that gives you that feeling of wanting to know more. Callisto Protocol, it just kind of felt like they kept adding and adding and adding things to the story. And then they tried to wrap it all up really quickly, and it didn't work at all. And then, I mean, obviously, the big thing with the combat, it all starts with the horrific dodge mechanic. I mean, that, again, I said it on our Callisto episode, and I'll say it again here. I don't call for jobs normally. Whoever came up with that does not deserve to work in video game development. That is a horrible, horrible design choice. But as bad as Callisto Protocol is, not even as bad. I mean, I think Callisto Protocol is still a game I could give a 7 reasonably. Maybe a 6 if I'm really angry. But as disappointing as that was, it's nice to know that Dead Space holds up today. That a remake of Dead Space, again, one of the best horror games of all time, I think we can say, it holds up in 2023. And that's really impressive because years of age like that, a decade of time, does not age every game gracefully like it did Dead Space. Not every game is that fortunate whatsoever. Like, not every game gets The Last of Us and the Dead Space treatment. A lot of remakes sometimes feel like just cash grabs, and I feel like this one was very well done. And I think the developers need to be very, very proud of the work. Hopefully it leads to Dead Space 2 being remade. I am intrigued by that.
Yes.
Hopefully it leads to that. So that is going to wrap up this episode of Side Mission. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Side Mission Pod. You can also check us out on Facebook at Side Mission Podcast. For the boys, for Kyle, for Matt, I'm Rusty. Thanks for listening.